Hello, welcome in. Today I'm just here to talk about all of the books that I read in July. This month I did get a lot of good reading done because I participated in the tarot readathon and I also did reading vlogs for it. So if you've watched those, you've heard me talk a little bit about all of these books, but I'll try to be a little bit more organized and in-depth for this wrap up. First of all, I read several books that were kind of for school. The first one was a reread of Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. So it's a post-apocalyptic novel and we follow a group of survivors who travel from town to town and perform music and Shakespeare plays for other survivors and just trying to keep alive like what was best about the world that we lost. Rereading this because my friends and I did a conference presentation on it and we focused on the ideas of like nostalgia and memory, what kind of things get salvaged and reused from the past and how we use those things, whether they're objects or ideas or memories, to build the future. And this reread really made me appreciate this book for what it actually is, because the first time that I read it way back in like 2016, I really was just so caught up on the idea of like the apocalypse and a pandemic. Like that to me was so scary. I don't even think I really absorbed like what this book is actually about. And now this time I feel like I have a little bit more and I really loved it. Another book that I read for school was this, Gothic and Gender. I'm going to be writing my master's thesis and focusing on Gothic literature. So I have a whole bunch of books like this from the library that are just kind of like collections of different like articles and essays and like chapters analyzing different Gothic works through a bunch of different lenses, and I'm hoping that some of them will help me kind of narrow down what I want to focus on. This one did not. I didn't find anything super intriguing for me in here, but it was still really nice to kind of get an overview of some of the concepts. And then also for potential inspiration for my thesis, I read The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which is a horror novella from like the 1800s about these two children who have been orphaned and they're being taken care of by their uncle, but he's not really involved. He just kind of has them living in this old house, and the only people around are like the housekeeper, the groundskeeper, and a governess. And this book follows a woman who is hired to be the new governess, and she never really gets a clear answer on like what happened to the old governess. And as she stays in the house with the children, some weird things start going on. She starts seeing like visions and ghosts, and she becomes convinced that these ghosts are out to hurt the children. But what I really loved about this book was that there's so much like psychological like uncertainty to it. You never really know, first of all, if the governess is like making it all up, or maybe she is seeing these things but they might not be real, or maybe they are really ghosts in the house. Like you never really know. I also thought that it had some interesting commentary because it starts out like the story of the governess and these kids and stuff is actually framed. It's just a story that somebody's telling because there's a group of people at this party swapping scary stories and talking about like what makes a story scary and how do you tell a good ghost story. And then one of the guests is like, oh, I know a scary story that happened to like a friend of mine who was a governess or whatever. And I thought that that also added like a really cool meta element to it too, like what we find scary and how we interpret horror and stuff like that. And I really enjoyed it. Even though I will say the writing style was driving me up the wall. Like it is an older classic and I struggle so much. It actually makes me feel so embarrassed of myself because you would think that I would be better at reading older writing styles because I read so many for school. But no, every time I read like an older classic, I struggle so much with the English and the writing style and just how they word things. And I feel like so much of my brain power goes towards just trying to figure out what it's literally saying in each sentence, like what's just going on, that it does pull me out of the story a little bit. And I think that this would have been even more scary and even more fun to read if I had been able to like completely immerse myself and not just be struggling with the writing style the whole time. Yeah, ultimately I really liked it and I thought it was really good. After that, for the tarot readathon and just for fun, I decided to reread House of Salt and Sorrow and then read its sequel, House of Roots and Ruin by Erin Craig. And it was so fun to like revisit and finish this duology. The first book, if you haven't read it, is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses fairy tale, and it's about these 12 sisters who are part of the noble family of their region, which is, the setting is so good. It's like a gloomy seaside, like briny. They worship the old gods of the sea and live in a Gothic castle on the cliffs above the ocean and stuff. So good. But basically the plot is that they're kind of dying off one by one under mysterious circumstances, and they think that there might be a curse, and they're just kind of trying to figure out what's going on. And then the second book, I don't know if this is a retelling of anything, but it follows the youngest sister after she's grown up and she's still kind of like dealing and struggling with the aftermath of all of the horrible things that happened in her family in the first book. But she decides to take a job as a portrait painter for this other like noble family that lives in a region all about gardens and flowers and trees and plants. Again, the vibes, the setting, like Erin Craig, she creates such a masterpiece out of these settings and I love them so much. And yeah, the stories are so good and so interesting. And even, oh my God, the ending of the second book, no spoilers, but if you've read it, I could not believe this ending. Like I read this ending and I was just like, jaw on the floor for like 5 minutes just sitting there. I truly enjoyed both of these books. The next books that I want to talk about are all from Penguin Teen, which have come out in the last couple weeks or will be coming out in the next few weeks. The first one I want to talk about is another kind of creepy ghosty story, and it's called Come Out by Natalie C. Parker, which I was really excited about because I loved her book Beware the Wild, which was, I mean, an early booktube gem that I loved so much. And I will say that this book, it was a little bit different than I was expecting. We're following two teenagers who, when they were children, they had like a third best friend, and they were all kind of in middle school figuring out like their identities and who they are in regards to gender and sexuality and stuff. And there was this old abandoned house that they would hang out in when they just needed some space to like be themselves and hang out with each other. But one night, one of them went missing and the other two don't remember anything. And so now years later, they're in high school and they start seeing the ghost of their friend who went missing, and it stirs things up and the story kind of starts from there. So that's the premise, and I really thought that this was going to be much more heavy on the supernatural horror, but it actually leaned so much more into like the social issues side of things, and it was a really like emotional and heartfelt exploration of like the things that these teenagers are going through and what, you know, kids all the time are going through with stuff like this. So while it wasn't necessarily the ghost story that I thought it was going to be, I think it was still a really beautiful book that I would recommend. The next one that I want to talk about, which was a ghost story, a haunted house story through and through, and that was Holly Horror: The Longest Night. This is a sequel to the first Holly Horror book, which is about a teenage girl who moves into an old family home, and there's some ghosty stuff going on with a girl who went missing from the house in the 80s and also a girl who went missing in the 1800s. And this sequel, I think, was a much needed like continuation and closure of the story that we started in the first book, but I will say that it didn't have me as invested and the plot just wasn't quite as intriguing as the first book was for me, but it still did have the elements that I really loved about the first book. It feels like a B-rate horror movie, which is a big compliment. Like, I mean that with so much love. Like, that's truly what I want out of this book, and it delivered. And also there are moments that are so genuinely scary, and like the visual imagery that I got from these books will stick with me because there were some genuinely terrifying moments and images and like jump scares even in a book, which I think is really cool. Another really good Penguin Teen arc that I'm so glad I got to read was Under the Surface. This is about the catacombs in Paris. It's about a group of students who are on a class trip, and a few of them get invited by this like random French guy to go to a party down in the catacombs. Scary, and they go, but they end up getting lost in the catacombs, and of course creepy things start happening. This was so good. Again, like a very good B-rated horror movie. Like survival horror, right? Like you're trapped in an underground cave with limited supplies, no one's coming to find you, like that kind of horror, but also some like questionably supernatural, you know, like are you gonna get murdered by ghosts or serial killers or like whatever it is that's following you around the catacombs. Just such a like chef's kiss, honestly. And my one complaint with it actually is that I think it tried to go a little bit too serious. There were so many times that the author was obviously trying to draw some kind of like meaningful psychological or emotional connection between, you know, the main character going through this and also reflecting on things that happened to her in her childhood and like her relationship with her parents and stuff like that. But for me, it wasn't really like integrated well enough to be actually meaningful, and it just felt kind of like the author felt like she should have stuff like that in there, so she tossed some in. Still just like such a fun time, such a blast, highly recommend. And then the last Penguin Teen arc that I want to talk about is a graphic novel called Luminous Beings, and this comes out in September. This is kind of like a post-apocalyptic zombie squirrel situation, which is so funny, and I really loved that. For the most part, the setting actually felt mostly normal. Like it's not very apocalyptic. They're still kind of living normal lives and going to high school and planning to go to college and stuff. They just like, I don't know, have to wear hazmat suits when they go outside. And And the story, I think like the main point of it is that there's a guy that lived in their town who was like kind of a town legend, and at the beginning of the zombie squirrel situation, he went off grid to like live in the woods. And now that things have like settled down and are like kind of normal again, this group of teenagers is like, I wonder if that guy knows that the world is okay, or if he's still like in the woods thinking it's still the apocalypse, and so they go try and find him to let him know, I guess. Honestly, I wasn't really fully drawn into the storyline and I wasn't really enjoying it. I think for me it was just like the writing style and the way that the characters talked. There was a lot of like overly contrived slang and like overly quirky, funny swear words, but it was a little bit cringe to me. And it just didn't feel real. Like the characters to me didn't feel like real people because they were talking like this, and it pulled me out of the story. Yeah, I don't know, I just wasn't super into this, but I will say the art style was excellent. The zombie squirrels and the color palette was to die for. Like it was beautiful to look at, even if I wasn't really enjoying the story or the characters. And speaking of graphic novels, another one that I read for the readathon was Little White Duck, which is about the author's experiences growing up as a child in China around the time when Mao died and the country kind of had a big shift. And it's basically just like a collection of little snippets, like moments from her childhood that she remembered or that were significant to her for whatever reason. And I did really enjoy them, but I felt myself not really being able to grasp like what, if I was supposed to be taking something out of this, or if there was some kind of like message or something I was supposed to learn. A lot of the other reviews that I read for this graphic novel were criticizing it for being very complimentary towards Mao and like how China was under Mao's rule. And I don't necessarily know if that's what she was trying to do or if she was just portraying like the actual experiences that she had and her family had and the opinions that they would have had during this time period about what their lives were like and how they were changing. So I don't know, as just a portrayal of a childhood in a specific time and place and what that experience was like, I think that this graphic novel was very nice. The next books that I want to talk about are audiobooks that I listened to on Librofm, which is my favorite place to listen to audiobooks because when you purchase an audiobook here, you get to choose where your money goes, and if you want it to support a local bookstore, an independent bookstore that you really like. My purchases currently support a bookshop in Berlin called The Curious Fox, and I just think it's really nice. So there's a link to this down below, which also helps me out if you're interested. But the first audiobook that I want to talk about is Chlorine. I read this for the readathon and it was so weird and so good. It's about a young Chinese American girl who is on the swim team and all of the societal pressures and expectations that go along with being a teenage girl and all of the kind of really disturbing, weird, and traumatizing things that just are part of that package, especially because the main character is also Chinese American and her parents are immigrants, so there's this kind of like added racial pressure and cultural pressure on her as well. And eventually it all takes like a very big, very real mental toll on her. And the book is up to interpretation. Like there are so many different ways to kind of think about what happens or doesn't happen in this book. And it was just so, when I say disturbing, weird, and traumatizing, that applies not only to like the very real things that the book is commenting on, but also like the book itself. It was just really weird and I really loved it. Like I wasn't sure at first, but it was weird in a way that I really, really loved and really enjoyed. So I do recommend this if you're also into that kind of thing. The next audiobook that I listened to was Hula, and this was one of my favorite things that I read all month. This book follows a kind of like generational family storyline with 3 different women from a Hawaiian family, which has been a very important family in their community. And as we follow the story of the family, we're also learning the story of this community and the things that have happened in a community-wide level, and also the history of Hawaii as a whole and as a kingdom, and how it went from being its own sovereign nation to being annexed by the US, and all of the consequences of that and the ways that it affected the Hawaiian people. And of course the characters that we're following growing up in different phases of this sequence of events. And honestly, I thought that these levels of the story intertwined and were threaded together so well, and so effectively. And I felt myself really truly invested and pulled into all the different levels of the book. Like, I cared so much about the characters and what they were personally going through, and I cared about the overarching environment of like what's going on politically with the country they live in. And it was like not only interesting to learn about the history and kind of see these like personal representations of how it plays out in people's lives, but also it was really strongly emotional. And I was feeling so frustrated and so angry at like the injustice and the unfairness of everything that's going on. I was actually shocked at like how much I was feeling, especially because it's an audiobook and I usually really struggle to fully immerse and fully connect, but not with this one. I was like fully locked in the entire time, and I would highly recommend this book. Like, I really am glad that I read this. And then the last audiobook that I listened to was Homeward. This is set in the 1960s, and it's about a young Black woman who goes through some like tragedies early on in life and kind of loses the things that she felt she was meant to do with her life, and eventually she regains that sense of purpose and finds herself wrapped up in like what's going on in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I really enjoyed this book. The story was really emotional and the main character was so sweet, and I liked her so much and was rooting for her. And I also really liked the author's note, which talks about how, you know, when we talk about the civil rights movement or like Black history in general, it tends to get watered down to like 2 or 3 people that we like to remember and like 2 or 3 major events that we say were really important. But there was actually so much going on. There were so many people, so many notable events, and so many different like aspects and facets to the civil rights movement that we just simply don't talk about anymore, and they're becoming kind of lost to history. And so the author, in writing this book, tried to incorporate a lot of the like lesser known things that were going on in the 60s. And I just really liked it. I really, really enjoyed this. So that is everything that I read in July. I'm really happy with how much I got to read in July. The readathon definitely helped and kept me committed. And yeah, it was a good month for me. I would love to hear what you were up to in July, if you did any reading that was really cool for you, any activities in general that you really liked. I would just love to know. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that I get to talk to you soon. Bye!